Can't believe you haven't seen Cujo. What is wrong with you?
Relax. It's not like it's Citizen Kane.
Have you ever tried to sit through Citizen Kane?
Yeah, I know. It's really boring, but it's like a big deal.
During sophomore year of college, I made the decision to minor in film studies, and paired with one of my required classes was something called Film Lab, where we would basically just go into an on-campus theater and we would all collectively watch the movie that we're supposed to be discussing in class that week. So basically, it was like a mandatory trip to the movies, which is nice. Except one of those weeks, the movie we were going to be discussing in class was Citizen Kane. So I went to the little movie theater, I marked down my attendance, and I got in a really comfy seat in the very back, and I made sure I was going to be completely undisturbed for the movie's 2-hour duration, because I had heard so much about it, and I was so excited to finally get to see it, and like in such favorable conditions, like this was the ideal scenario. And 20 minutes in, I was completely knocked out. Like, I straight up passed out. I was in a whole other plane of existence. In all ways but physical, I was no longer in that movie theater. And then after a nice, 80-minute nap, I woke up on my own around 20 minutes before the end of the movie. So, I caught the first 20 minutes and the last 20 minutes. And then a month later, I chose this exact movie to write about for our midterm without revisiting it or rewatching it. And I actually found so much to talk about from the measly 40 minutes I managed to catch of the movie that I had to cut myself off to make sure it didn't cut into the time I needed for the rest of the questions on the exam. And one interpretation of that description I just gave is that the middle is filler, which is the one I went with for a while. And I didn't miss anything by falling asleep. But in hindsight, I really don't think that's what it was at all. It's just that the movie is very packed. It has that much to analyze, that much to discuss and write about and talk through, that in those 40 minutes alone, I got more material to analyze for my midterm than any of the other movies I could have written about that I watched for that class from start to finish. I've never done this before, but I decided to open with a personal anecdote because I feel like when people go in with specific expectations of this movie, they have such vitriolic hate for it. And I feel like this incident actually highlights the two separate takes on Citizen Kane that can manage to coexist pretty well. I feel like Citizen Kane now, maybe, is not meant to be watched entirely or purely for entertainment. Time, technological advancement, growth in the language of cinema, and just a much higher level of stimulation and all the entertainment we consume have all taken so much of its entertainment value away from it. At the end of the day, it's the story of a man's life, done with the means they had at the time. He's also a man who was kind of annoying and got on my nerves, hence me falling asleep. But back then, part of Citizen Kane's entertainment value resided in the unprecedented level of innovation it was presenting to its audience with every showing of the movie. Hence, my ability to spend an entire exam's duration talking about it, and I barely even watched half of it. And that's the lens Citizen Kane might need to be watched through now, to be given a fair chance and to be appreciated correctly. Also, while researching for this video, I discovered that in terms of drama, there was so much of it behind the scenes that it almost overshadows the movie's plot. So now, I kind of want to make sure to get to talk about that too. As always, I will first start with the plot, so we have a baseline to work from, so there will be spoilers for Citizen Kane, obviously. Citizen Kane opens with the death of Charles Foster Kane, an enormously wealthy newspaper publisher and failed politician. While on his deathbed, he drops a snow globe and utters the word Rosebud, probably one of the most recognizable lines in cinema. We then get a quick newsreel of the highlights of Kane's life, which does a really good job setting the apexes of the narrative for us before we actually get into the movie. It helps situate you in Kane's life, especially with the non-linear nature of the narrative. It allows for less confusion. The movie then follows a reporter as he interviews the people who have been in Kane's life while trying to uncover what the true meaning of Rosebud was and why that was his last word. The first person Thompson, the journalist, tries to approach is Kane's second wife, Susan Alexander, who we see is now an alcoholic, and she refuses to speak to the reporter. Thompson then gets access to the personal archives of Walter Parks Thatcher, a banker who was actually Kane's guardian growing up. When Kane was young, a mine that his mother owned struck gold, providing him with the fortune that will dictate the rest of his life. One of the scenes I remember most vividly from the movie is the one with Kane's parents discussing his guardianship with Thatcher, as his mother decided to use that wealth to establish a trust to provide for Kane's education, and in turn, the bank gained guardianship of him. Outside, you see Kane playing in the snow, while the debate inside between the three adults is ongoing. And once it's decided, Kane obviously doesn't take the decision well, and he strikes Thatcher with his sled and then tries to run away. At the age of 25, Kane gains control of his trust, immediately making him one of the richest men in the world because of the mine's wealth and also because of Thatcher's investments. He then decides to buy the New York Enquirer, a newspaper, and due to the nonlinear narrative, we actually flash forward to him having to sell it to Thatcher years later following the stock market crash. Throughout his life, Kane gains fame and notoriety by using his newspaper to manipulate public opinion and by marrying the niece of the President of the United States. Thompson then interviews Kane's ex-best friend, Jedediah Leland, and we get another of the movie's most memorable scenes, with Kane and his first wife Emily around the breakfast table, showcasing the disintegration of their marriage visually, without ever leaving this one location. Leland then recounts the beginnings of Kane's affair with who is to become his second wife, Susan Alexander, whom we met at the very beginning of the movie. He begins an affair with her after meeting her one night while on his way to a warehouse that had his stuff from his childhood. While running for governor and being actually favored to win, Kane's wife and his political opponent find out about this affair. And while Kane seemed to truly believe that it would have minimal impact on him, the resulting scandal actually ends up ending his political career. He then marries Susan and forces her into a career as an opera singer because she mentioned once that she likes to sing, and dude just would not let that go. He literally built her an opera house. Opera singing is hard, you guys, and Susan's just not cut out for it. So her entire career is just a humiliation, and Kane ends up finding Leland passed out in the middle of writing a scathing review of Susan's performance for the newspaper. He's writing the review for the newspaper. The performance is not for the newspaper. I worded that sentence weird. And basically it was just an honest review. And Kane ends up firing him, which is shitty, but he also finishes up the review for him and he publishes it because he's kind of fucking weird sometimes. Despite her protest though, Kane forces Susan to continue the season. I don't know what season, the opera season? Thompson then finally gets to interview Susan, and she describes how negative of an impact the career he forced her into had on her, to the point that she ends up attempting suicide. After that, he finally lets her quit this thing she never wanted to do anyway, but their marriage is never a really good one, and eventually she decides to leave him, prompting another really memorable scene in the movie where Kane trashes the entire place. But then he sees a snow globe, he gets calm, and he says, "Rosebud." Weirdly, that's when Thompson decides that the meaning of the word is going to be a mystery for eternity, and he gives up on his search. And I get it, but I also say weirdly because we went through this whole movie, and then finally it seems like he's getting somewhere, and he decides to throw in the towel now. What a quitter. Anyway, we then see Kane's stuff being sorted through and disposed of, and we see the sled that he was playing with as a child when he got taken away, and it's getting burned. And then we see that it says Rosebud on it, letting us know that on his deathbed, all Kane truly wanted out of life was to get back to the joy and innocence of his childhood, back to being surrounded and loved by his parents. And that's it. That's the greatest movie of all time. Yay! Okay, but for real, let's talk about all the drama that led to and followed the creation of the movie, and then we can talk about why it really is one of the greatest movies of all time. For as dramatic as Kane's life might seem, the BTS of this movie was even more dramatic. And the drama started right from the jump. Actually, before the movie was even conceived of. From the very beginning, the deal that even allowed for the existence of Citizen Kane was something that garnered massive reactions from people in the industry. A lot of them pretty negative. I'm honestly not entirely sure how he did it. Even with all the research I did, I couldn't figure it out. But basically, after his success in theater and in radio, Orson Welles was basically given carte blanche to work on 3 movies by the studio RKO. He could do what he wanted, direct it however he wanted, hire whomever he wanted, make the movie he wanted, and at some point, as long as his budget was approved by the studio, the world was basically his playground and he could just create. Now, this already sounds almost too good to be true, even by today's standards. That's what established directors long for and dream of, even now when auteurs and their visions are highly encouraged and are something that we often show appreciation for. But back then, we're talking studio system. People were not getting this kind of creative freedom. No one was getting this. And the negative reaction came from the fact that Orson Welles had never directed a movie before. He'd worked on other stuff, he'd proven himself as a genius in a myriad of other mediums, but he had never made a movie. And now he basically had more freedom and control to create whatever he wanted, however he wanted, than anyone else in the industry got. Of course, the reaction to it was extreme, as reactions tend to be, in both directions. People were either rooting for him to showcase the value of allowing artists to take control of the creative process rather than being driven by the studios and their demand, or people were just preying on his downfall.
A genius is a crackpot on a tightrope. Hollywood is watching Orson Welles, wondering if his foot will slip. Variety, after Orson Welles signed a contract with RKO that gave him extraordinary creative control over his productions.
And this is relevant because the people who were rooting for this to fail latched onto the subsequent drama that comes up later. But it's also relevant because this deal and its unprecedented parameters are what allowed Citizen Kane to be Citizen Kane, to permanently make its mark on the cinematic landscape, to spend the rest of time inspiring future directors and movie makers, showing them at a very young age what you are capable of doing with the visual storytelling devices at your disposal. Had it not been for this deal, Orson Welles would not have had the freedom to run amok and drill holes into cameras and take apart furniture. He would not have been able to allow Greg Toland to run amok either, allowing them to alter filmmaking and the art of cinematography forever. The deal is important because it allows us to see why Citizen Kane was able to be what it is. But it also gives us a sense of what Welles was up against, of the loudness of his detractors, and why it was more than most people would have had to deal with their first projects. It allows us to see the lucky break he landed, but also the subsequent lack of luck in pretty much every other aspect, and the acerbic reception he was getting almost everywhere. That only got worse after the movie was done, which brings me to the second half of the behind-the-scenes drama. There was obviously more drama with the movie's creation and stuff. Well, not really drama, just like things were happening, I guess. I don't know. We'll cover the creation and the outcome and all the other stuff in the next section. But the biggest round of drama, and the one that threatened the movie's very existence and its ability to be seen, came after the movie was made. Orson Welles kept the movie really under wraps while it was being made. I'm assuming for a lot of reasons, so no one would be able to meddle with his vision, and it honestly was probably really clever of him.
Once production began, Welles ran a closed set and strictly limited access to rehearsals and filming. Most of the daily call sheets were inscribed with the firm closing line, "No visitors, please." Only cast, crew, and invited guests, such as director John Ford, were welcome. RKO management was not.
But then, when people did get access to the movie, all hell kind of broke loose. You see, the movie's titular character, Charles Foster Kane, bore a striking resemblance to a real-life newspaper magnate, William Randolph Hearst. A very striking resemblance. I mean, it's way past now, but Kane is definitely largely based on him. It is very hard to argue otherwise. His profession, his foray into politics, his sensational headlines, his house, even his mistress. It was very, inspired by him. There are even direct quotes from Hearst that appear almost unaltered in the movie, spoken by Kane.
However, two true and well-known incidents appear in Citizen Kane that were unquestionably linked directly to Hearst. Early in the film, when Kane's banker guardian, Walter Thatcher, warns the young publisher that he is losing $1 million a year by operating the New York Enquirer, Kane quips,
"You know, Mr. Thatcher, at the rate of $1 million a year, I'll have to close this place in 60 years.
The line, famous in newspaper circles, came from a comment by Hearst's mother, Phoebe, who was asked about her son losing $1 million a year on his San Francisco Examiner and New York Journal and replied, "At that rate, he'll last 30 years. Even more damaging was dialogue in the same scene that included Kane's response to a cable from Wheeler, his correspondent in Cuba, who could not find signs of a military uprising against Spanish rule.
Dear Wheeler, you provide the prose poems, I'll provide the war."
It reprised a much-cited exchange between Hearst and his artist Frederick Remington, who, before the Spanish-American War, was Hearst's correspondent in Cuba. When Remington did not find bloodshed or atrocities, he wired to Hearst, "Everything quiet, there is no trouble here. There will be no more, I wish to return." Instead of recalling him, Hearst wired back, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war."
But the thing is, these things happen when you're a public figure. They happen all the time. At least the movie extended him the courtesy of not outright naming the character after him in any way. In fact, he's name dropped in the movie as someone else that exists in the universe, kind of intentionally separating Kane's existence from the real Hearst, no matter how based on him he actually was. But the problem is that Hearst clearly had a fragile ego and way too much power. He, or on the surface, it was just the people connected to him, but realistically it was definitely him behind the scenes. But anyway, they launched an all-out campaign to get rid of the movie in any way they could. They smeared it and its very existence in every way possible in the press, which, let me remind you, is Hearst's business. The press is him. He owns the newspapers. So on top of the regular campaigns that would happen in situations like this, he also refused to run any ads or refer to the movie at all in any of his papers, of which there were numerous. And in further attempts to suppress the movie, he actually tried to punish the studio as a whole by not having ads or mentions of any of their movies appear in the paper. That restriction was eventually lifted, but restrictions on any mentions of Citizen Kane specifically persisted for a while. There was even an attempt by the president of MGM, the most powerful studio at the time, which makes him probably the most powerful man in show business at the time, to buy the footage of the film and burn them. It was an attempt to erase it completely from existence and waste all their hard work before anyone even got to see it. Thankfully, that didn't come to fruition, but the offer was actually considered for a time. Now, all this drama is not just to emphasize what was happening around Citizen Kane even further. Although recounting this is important to show how much its enduring success is an even bigger deal than we think it is, when we take into account everything that surrounded it. Like, Citizen Kane's success, despite the whole world being out to get it, was largely due to how groundbreaking and just good the movie was. People who got to attend screenings of it during this tumultuous time when no one knew what its fate was going to be were immediately avid supporters, and were the ones who started aggressively calling for the suppression campaign to come to an end. Like, the reason the studio didn't take them up on that offer to buy out the movie and burn it was because they knew there would be violent backlash from the side of the industry defending it.
Never in my experience in the business have I screened a picture before such a tough and professional audience as I did last night and received such a wonderful reaction, Schaefer wired Wells the next day. The picture not only received a wonderful round of applause, but each and every guest was most enthusiastic about one of the great motion pictures that had ever come out of Hollywood.
But no, I'm actually not spending so much time on the drama for any of this, or at least not specifically to point this stuff out, but to point out that because as much as we want to say this campaign against it didn't work, it kind of did. Citizen Kane was very much suppressed. The footage wasn't burned, no, its release wasn't cancelled, and it did get to come out. But one of the elements of the suppression campaign, and in hindsight, I think probably the most effective one, was keeping it out of movie theaters. Hearst's influence and connections managed to get, cinema chains to refuse to show the movie. Some of them, obviously not all of them, but its showing was very minimal, and the ads advertising these showings were also suppressed, since Hearst publications wouldn't run them. And they were also mistimed in general, the campaign for it, the ad campaign for it was very mistimed because of all the delays the movie's release had to go through. So basically they were promoting it and then it just didn't come out for a while, so all the promotion was wasted. And to place it in context, this was 1941. This was before even TV got big. There was no other way to consume film, basically. Nothing on demand, no way to control your viewing. If you couldn't see the movie in a movie theater near you, if you didn't have relatively easy access to it that way, you simply were not going to see it. So a lot of people simply did not see it. It was not an utter financial failure, especially given all the circumstances surrounding it, but it was not the success that you may assume it must have been either. Most of its success was in its reception as a work of art, because even with all this, it was still very hard to deny its groundbreaking techniques and the artistic innovation that was on display within it. So it was nominated for a whole bunch of Oscars and stuff, but even enjoying comfortable success critically, it was not considered the greatest film of all time immediately either. Even claims of its status amongst other films were tempered, comparing it to other movies and stuff. And it had to grow steadily over time. Like I said, it was nominated for a whole bunch of Oscars, but it only won one. And it wasn't even for any of the incredible visual work that went into the movie. It was for the fucking script. So despite it not being something that could be ignored critically, it was not immediately seen as the seminal work it would later be hailed as either. No. The perception of Citizen Kane had a kind of slow and steady climb, and it wasn't really until the rise of television that its impact truly hit its stride. It's kind of a tale as old as time, isn't it? A work of art so far ahead of its surroundings that its appreciation is significantly delayed until a younger generation gets access to it. And while that's not exactly what happened with Citizen Kane per se, because it was almost immediately seen as the artistically significant work it is by the people who actually did get a chance to see it, some variation of that did take place. Appreciation for Citizen Kane actually started gaining traction in France initially, with the publications of Cahiers du Cinéma, focusing on the art of filmmaking and providing the space to discuss the exceptional work that was done in the movie. Then finally, with the rise of television, RKO's film catalog was amongst the first to get sold to TV stations to be broadcast on them. And that is when a much wider audience got to see Citizen Kane. And that was when it started climbing up every greatest movie list there ever was.
Ironically, it was the steady stream of films available on television, the principal villain in the fall of the Hollywood studios, that helped resurrect classic motion pictures with a new audience of young post-war viewers. When the studios began to sell or lease their film catalogs for broadcast, RKO's products were among the first to go on the market. Within months, Citizen Kane aired on television for the first time. By the mid-1950s, Citizen Kane's reputation was beginning to solidify, As early as 1952, a poll of film critics conducted by British film magazine Sight and Sound, a once-each-decade survey that has become one of the benchmarks of cinematic achievement, ranked Citizen Kane as first runner-up in its listing of the top 10 best films. In 1962, the Sight and Sound poll voted Citizen Kane the best film of all time. While most other films included in the survey have dropped off with the passing decades, Citizen Kane has remained at or near the top of the Sight and Sound poll since then.
But the issue tends to be that us watching it right now with no context of what things were like when it actually came out strips it of the wow factor that it must have had for the people watching it then, especially for young filmmakers who felt inspired and pulled to the art of filmmaking by it, as they had not seen anything like that before. There are a lot of technical aspects to the innovative way that Citizen Kane told its story, and I will go over some of those a bit more in a little, but I think it just comes down to the fact that Orson Welles clearly wanted to turn every part of the filmmaking process into another device in his storytelling. He did not just rely on the same tactics and the industry standard practices of filmmaking, like stationary cameras, shot reverse shot, standard light formations, which is what everyone else was doing. Maybe it was inspired by him coming from other mediums and having more toys to play with and more elements within his control when it came to movie making, so he understood the potential of every element that everyone else took for granted, like lighting, shadows, using sets to create optical illusions, stuff like that. I think what it comes down to is that he actually used his medium to its full extent, instead of pushing it into the background and telling his story the same old standard way, and that was groundbreaking at the time.
I think it was the first time that I realized I was watching a film in which the actual art of film was being played with, director Sidney Pollack recalled of his initial viewing of Citizen Kane. It was the first time I saw this real feeling of passion about movie making itself. I was aware that the filmmaking process itself was a vivid part of the storytelling. I kept thinking, wait a minute, you mean you can do that? Well, then you could do anything you wanted.
A big part of Orson Welles being able to pull this off is the people he chose to put on his team, and specifically his cinematographer Greg Toland, who deserves so much of the credit for so much of what Citizen Kane managed to do that his name actually appears in the credits next to Orson Welles, the director, which is something that doesn't really happen. I was gonna say it didn't happen at the time, but I feel like it doesn't really happen now either very much. Sharing that screen as the director with your cinematographer, and his presence there is merely a testament to how much the movie that came out was due to his work, that Orson Welles is openly acknowledging that, and he continues to openly acknowledge it.
The greatest gift a young director could ever have is a cameraman who would do anything you asked, Welles said of Greg Toland. Wells never forgot Toland's role in the success of his first motion picture. 30 years after the film was released, he was still singing Toland's praises. It's impossible to say how much I owe to Greg, Wells recalled in 1971. He was superb. He was the greatest gift that any director, young or old, could ever have.
Things the team up between Toland and Welles created that were not really done at the time included the care put into the overall mise-en-scène of the movie and how much importance was placed on the atmosphere, but also specifically elements like the chiaroscuro lighting style of the whole film, the utilization of shadows and lighting in an artistic manner, beyond just lighting up the set so that the actors are visible, and integrating it into the storytelling in a way that adds a whole other layer to how the visuals land. Like in this scene where Kane is writing his declaration of principles as an optimistic youth who seemed to have put too much faith in his own moral fortitude, based on how much this declaration of principles basically falls apart later on in his life. The way Kane is completely in the shadows while doing this takes away from a moment that could otherwise feel triumphant and cast doubt over its validity, over how true to Kane these principles truly are. And in turn, by casting Kane himself in the shadows during this, the emphasis then falls on the people he is with and their reactions, especially his best friend, who becomes a casualty of Wells losing sight of that very declaration of principles later on. It's nothing short of masterful. And also in the very beginning, with the reporters cast in silhouette, using low-key harsh lighting, reducing them to a faceless mob as their individuality recedes into the darkness, and the questions they are posing and their quest for answers takes the foreground of importance in the scene. There's also the tracking shots and the way he used the camera to tell the story instead of using it in the standard stationary manner, and cutting between the usual close-up shots that were in every movie at the time. Like they even had to make props that would break down for shots like this to allow the camera to glide through uninterrupted and unencumbered by such trivial things like, I don't know, fucking furniture. There's also the depth of focus in the movie, which went all the way to the background, something the audiences were not used to at the time. And it's also used as an element directly in the storytelling to add to the movie. So we'll go back to this scene, where you can clearly see Kane playing in the background happily with his sled while the debate over his guardianship and his trust is happening with the adults in the foreground. Being able to see Kane so clearly in that scene adds to its impact. And as we later learn, it's a pivotal time for his character, and what the search throughout the whole movie is basically coming down to. Again, these were things that were really not done at the time. There are so many elements that were revolutionized in the way they were utilized in Citizen Kane. But I don't want this to turn into like a film studies lecture, so I just try to focus on my favorite ones. There's also the fact that, again, Wells wasn't doing them just for the sake of doing them. They all play directly into the mise en scène, adding to the story being told and the way it impacts the audience. They were used as devices to further elevate the movie experience instead of being what the movie is entirely about. Because this wasn't like an art project where he was doing a slideshow of cool camera tricks. This was a movie where he wanted to use everything at his disposal, integrating it all into the story he was telling. And that in turn opened everyone's eyes to what could be done with all the elements of filmmaking that were being taken for granted for so long. And the mere fact that what Citizen Kane did does not stand out to us too much in modern day is merely a testament to its impact. That it's so far-reaching, it has permeated movie making so thoroughly that it has now become the standard and has been perfected over time and through various technological innovations. So looking at the original might not be able to evoke the same sense of wonder in us as it must have for the people who saw it when it was the first one doing all these things.
Said Francois Truffaut about Citizen Kane, this film has inspired more vocations to the cinema than any other. Recalled Martin Scorsese, I really discovered what a director does when I saw Citizen Kane.
And I think that actually falls under the like Seinfeld is unfunny trope, which is a weird intersection of entertainment, but hear me out. I found that the other day and I think like as a basic concept, that's exactly what happened to Citizen Kane and the way it is perceived, and why we sometimes have such a hard time understanding its greatness and the magnitude of its impact right now. Basically, the Seinfeld is unfunny trope refers to people watching or consuming something, and then the critique of it and of its assigned greatness being that it's super old or overdone. And this is meant to point out the irony, like in the fact that none of these things were old or overdone when the work that is being criticized did them. In fact, it's actually where these things originated. And at the time, they were brand new and fresh and innovative. I don't know why I wrote that word too many times. And so well received that they have been replicated and sometimes copied to death by other works in the category that came after it. Why is that sentence so weird? Basically, like, people copied it afterwards. I don't know why that sentence was so convoluted. The page even lists this old joke as an example. I guess that's an old joke. It's credited as an old joke, so I guess it's an old joke. The trope is named after Seinfeld because it gets criticized for this exact thing, for its jokes being really old and overdone, when it's just everyone after Seinfeld copying it to death, that now it's become very old and overdone if you've consumed the content that came after it first. Now, I don't think this part applies to Citizen Kane exactly. Like, I don't really think the techniques and innovations done in Citizen Kane are ever really overdone or old. They're movie techniques. But I think they've been so normalized because they are used so often by people inspired by the movie and people inspired by the people who were inspired by the movie. They have lost their magic for people who watched the plethora of subsequent works that came after it. It's basically just a reiteration of what I said earlier, that the fact that we do not see anything new in Citizen Kane is merely proof of its ubiquitous influence on cinema and how it's actually present in almost everything else we consume. Well, movies, that was a dramatic statement, like in all the other movies we consume. I'm always in awe of works of art that do not take their medium for granted, that utilize everything they can to give a new and altered experience. You see that in things like the book House of Leaves or in Citizen Kane. But I've also always been fascinated by the way we perceive art and how art is so significantly altered based on the audience receiving it, and how sometimes it is so important to know the context, the environment something was created in, the cultural zeitgeist it was implementing itself into by existing, to be able to perceive it the way it was meant to be perceived, to be able to understand their reactions to it, to be able to contextualize its influence in history. And I feel like nowhere is the value of the historical context more important than Citizen Kane. So as someone who has an immense appreciation for what it did for film, and I have never-ending admiration for Orson Welles as a creator and just as like kind of a genius overall, but also as someone who literally fell asleep the first time I tried to watch this movie, I just wanted to use this video as a way to provide that context, to situate the movie in history for someone who maybe was not exposed to it yet, and to encourage you to watch it through a different lens. Nothing we create exists in vacuum, and a curse that art may be afflicted with is that sometimes it is immortalized and therefore preserved in that very vacuum that it was not created in, unable to immortalize its surroundings and the environment that prompted its creation along with it. And I think one thing we can do to give the art we consume a fair chance is to maybe familiarize ourselves with that missing context if we can, to briefly get in a time machine in whatever way is afforded to us, to understand what induced a work's existence and what it did for the creators who came after it, and how it altered the world around it, into the world we live in now, And that's it. That's all I wanted to do here, really. So, is Citizen Kane good? Yes, of course. It's a masterpiece. If you're willing to get in a time machine for a little bit for it to understand why.